So we will start off this morning with Logan Meredith. He's at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in physics, and he did his residencies, two of them, both at Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico. And I'm going to let him introduce his presentation and kick us off for today. Logan?
Thank you. So like she said, my name is Logan Meredith. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the work that I've been doing with fluid and kinetic methods for plasma simulation and combining them into what we call hybrid methods. And if none of that makes any sense, don't worry, because on the next couple slides, I'm going to be going over what all of that means and talking a little bit about why we might want to do that in the first place. After that, with you guys, I'm going to go through a construction of a hybrid fluid-kinetic numerical scheme, and I'll get into more specifics right before that after I've gone over the background. And then implement that in a code called HPIT2, which took up most of my time in my graduate research and was kind of the main chunk of that. And then finally, one of the projects that I worked on during one of my residencies at Sandia was identifying when kind of kinetic particles start to look like a fluid and then merging them into the underlying fluid to take advantage of some of the speed up that we can get with fluid methods. And again, that'll make more sense in the next couple slides. So just to set the stage, historically, when a plasma physicist has sat down and started to attack a plasma simulation, they've had to either use fluid or kinetic methods. Now, fluid methods tend to make some assumptions on the shape of the plasma distribution in order to save some time and evolve only selected moments of the distribution. These correspond to quantities, physical quantities of interest like density, momentum density, etc. And as a result, and this is a huge, lots of asterisks on this is a huge generalization, they tend to be pretty fast. They tend to be faster. But because we've made some assumptions on the plasma distribution, they have a limited regime of validity. So in contrast, kinetic methods retain all of that detailed velocity space information. And so they're able to characterize and capture far from equilibrium effects that fluid methods aren't able to take care of. But again, lots of asterisks here, they tend to be a little bit slower. Okay. So one of the problems is that plasmas that we want to simulate both in nature and in the lab frequently exhibit characteristics of both. So an example on the left here, I have a simulation of an electron beam propagating through a background gas, and that electron beam is not very fluid-like, it's not even close to equilibrium, and so we have to treat that kinetically, but the background gas is very fluid-like. So one could think of like a hybrid method that would simulate the background as a fluid and the electrons kinetically. And in the plot on the right here, it's not super important to understand what's going on here, but it's just a graph of the electron energy distribution functions in various regions of a simulation of an inductively coupled plasma. Not super important to understand all of this, but if you see a straight line, that means that at that location, the electrons are pretty fluid-like, and if there's a kink, they're not. So this shows that there's regions where we have electrons that are fluid-like and regions where it's not. So one can think of a hybrid method that kind of switches between a hybrid and kinetic description based on location. So it's worth taking a step back and thinking about what restrictions fluid models actually have. And there's a ton of models in the literature, but very generally, lots of asterisks on this too. They tend to assume that the velocity distribution for the plasma is nearly, if not in, local thermal equilibrium. So it's close to a Maxwellian. And plasmas will naturally head toward this state over time, usually due to collisions. So, but maybe far from it initially. So very broadly, hybrid methods seek the best of both worlds, the speed of fluid methods, plus the wide applicability of kinetic methods. And there's lots of different definitions for what hybrid means in literature. It's a pretty vague term. But I'm going to be focusing on the two bolded ones here, where we're going to use different models for different species. And throughout this talk, I'm going to call that hybrid by species. And also where we're going to use different models for the same species kind of in the same domain during the same simulation. I'll call this single species hybrid throughout this talk. So now that you guys know what hybrid methods mean, we can get into a construction of a hybrid by species numerical scheme. Before we do that, let's set aside, or let's think about what we want out of this scheme. I wanted this to be something that a researcher like in industry or a national lab would actually use, so it should use tried and true modern industry standard methods. It should be designed for supercomputers to be able to tackle really large problems that are the kind of problem of interest to industry. So to exploit kind of parallelizability and GPUs that are kind of just intrinsic to modern high-performance computing. There should be interactions or collisions between the fluid and kinetic components, kind because that's key physics that we don't want to have missing. And I wanted this to work with like arbitrary combinations of kinetic and fluid species, so I don't want there to be any hard coding kind of embedded in the scheme itself. So for the fluid component, I've elected to use the Runge-Kutta discontinuous Galerkin method. Most of this slide we can kind of just ignore. It's really only of interest to people with some finite element background, but the key point here that I want to emphasize is just in bold here, that the solution is defined on a mesh that we apply to the domain. And that's really the only important part about this, is that we're going to have our kind of fluid fields, density, momentum, density are going to be defined on this mesh. For the kinetic component, I'm going to be using the venerable particle and cell method. Probably most of you have heard about this, but just to give a brief intro, I'm going to model the plasma as a set of macro particles. And I use the word macro particle because each of these kind of computational particles that we track really represents many, many physical particles. And that still turns out to be a pretty good approximation of what's going on. These macro particles can move freely throughout our finite element mesh. Electromagnetic fields are interpolated at particle positions. We move the particles a small fraction of a time step, and after moving, the particles then distribute their charge back to the mesh so that we can reevaluate what the fields are for the next time step. So I've pointed out the fact that our fluid fields are defined on a mesh and the kinetic component is kind of defined as particles to emphasize that we have a kind of a disconnect in the descriptions between the two methods. So we have kind of a continuous field on one hand and particles on the other hand. So how do we encode collisions or interactions between the two? And it turns out that the Monte Carlo collision method, which has been in use for a while, gets us kind of most of the way there. Basically, the way this works is that for each of our kinetic particles, I'm going to sample, just like randomly draw from the fluid distribution, a collision partner. And then a collision is going to occur, whatever that means, with this probability. And then since the original Monte Carlo collision method doesn't actually encode the effects of the collision on the fluid, we have to kind of add those effects back into the fluid. And the way we do this pretty simply by when we kind of draw a collision partner, we're gonna remove its contributions to the fluid moments from the fluid. And then after the collision, if that collision partner survives, so if it's not a chemical reaction, if it doesn't transmute to something else, if it's like an elastic collision, for example, then we'll add its contributions to the fluid moments after the collision back into the fluid. And essentially what that does is it moves kind of some of the representation in the distribution from one region of phase space to another. And that's exactly what the Boltzmann collision operator, for example, encodes. So this gets the effects of the collision on the fluid exactly right. I'm going to skip the time integrator slide in the interest of time, and because it's not that interesting. But now we have a hybrid method, more or less. I skipped the time integrator part, but trust me that it works. And now we can write that in C++. And so that became HPIT2, which is a code that I developed from the ground up to be very modular. So it's easy to add new plasma models, like new fluids, new fluid types, or new particle types for new collisions. It's intended from the ground up to be used on modern high-performance computing systems. So we use the Cocos library out of Sandia for shared memory parallelism. Think GPUs, OpenMP, threading, and MPI for distributed memory parallelism. So think about kind of distributed systems like large clusters. Each independent compute node can handle like a chunk of the problem. HP2 installs with the SPAC package manager out of Lawrence Livermore. So if you want to install it, you can just write, ideally you just write SPAC install HP2 in your terminal, and after a couple minutes to hours, you have it. Input decks for HP2 are in the human readable TOML format. TOML likes to brag that the input decks are kind of uniquely mappable to Python dictionaries, so this facilitates really easy scripting. You can have like a Python script that just generates an input deck for you. Through Cocos, we can exploit the use of accelerators like GPUs and ostensibly FPGAs, but we haven't actually had anything to test on, but that's something that could maybe work. And finally, we use the MFEM library out of Lawrence Livermore for the finite element method. And on the right here, I just have a kind of an example video of a plasma sheath in like a fake star-shaped domain here. That kind of just looks pretty. So the typical way that PIC simulations are distributed on large clusters is that the domain is partitioned into non-overlapping subdomains, and each compute node is assigned one of these subdomains and is responsible for the particles on that subdomain. But the problem is that if one of the compute nodes fails, then you just lose all of the information about the plasma in that subdomain, and you have to restart from whatever your last checkpoint was or from the beginning if you don't have any checkpoints. So one of the ideas that we've been playing around with in HPIT2 is kind of a novel fault tolerance scheme where each compute node is responsible for particles on the entire domain. And what this means is that if a node fails, we can simply downsample and increase the weight of particles on each of the remaining nodes to compensate for the loss of one node. This comes with a couple of other advantages. We have reduced particle communication between nodes because we don't need to move particles between subdomains when they cross internode boundaries. And it's load balanced by construction, since each node is responsible or is kind of exploring the same regions of phase space. And just to show this in action, I have a simple simulation of a 1D two-stream instability. So I just have two kind of counter-streaming beams of electrons, and they interact electrostatically. I'm going to start this simulation off on 4 compute nodes, and I'm going to artificially kill one off every 165 time steps here. And it's important to note that the simulation continues at the same rate, because we're not adding or subtracting macroparticles from compute nodes. The macroparticle count stays the same. The only thing we're losing is some simulation fidelity. And so in this video on the right, you can kind of see around time step 330, and we'll step through this more slowly, but around time step 330, it like drastically thins out, but it keeps going at the same rate. So we can step through this a little bit more. This is 2 frames before I kill off one of the nodes, 1 frame, and then you can see it thins out a little bit. There's much fewer, there's about half as many particles as we started off with, but it keeps going, no problem. One of the other things that we were playing around with is dynamic coupling to a code called RustPCA. RustPCA is a binary collision approximation code. Basically what that means is that it handles ion surface or ion material interactions. So we basically treat RustPCA as kind of a boundary condition. When ions from our simulation hit a boundary, we pass it off to RustPCA, and it tells us whether the ion kind of reflects off or it gets implanted into the boundary or sputters off kind of some of the material that's implanted in the boundary. And to show this off a little bit, I have kind of a surrogate problem for the types of problems that might be of interest in semiconductor fab. So I have kind of a chlorine plasma sitting against a silicon wafer, and in that silicon wafer, I've kind of etched out some trenches, and even more of these trenches include some kind of non-trivial microfeatures and micro trenches in the bottom, just to show off some of the kind of complex domains that we can handle with thanks to the finite element method. And in the video on the top right here, I'm showing just kind of a plot of particle positions as the simulation evolves. And the blue particles are chlorine, and then at late times we start to get just a ton of silicon particles that are sloughing off thanks to RustPCA. And the bottom right shows just it is a video. It reaches equilibrium pretty quickly, but it's a video of the electric potential throughout this domain, and you can see that a sheath forms and kind of extends down into the trenches, and that facilitates further sputtering. So this problem, it would be kind of interest to kind of researchers in semiconductor fab or fusion energy sciences. We've also interfaced with the PUMI MBBL library. MBBL stands for multi-block boundary layer. And the idea here is that this is kind of in between a fully unstructured and a fully structured mesh. So we can handle some block structured domains, something more complicated. As an example on the right here is kind of another way that one might mesh kind of a problem with some trenches in it. We wouldn't be able to resolve some of those non-trivial microfeatures, but it's kind of it gets most of the job done. But the idea is that with this kind of semi-structured mesh, we can further optimize particle tracking and the field solve to really speed up simulations. And so this is something that can speed up problems in like block structure geometries. HPIT2 can also optionally use Boltzmann or adiabatic electrons. Electrons are a lot lighter, obviously, than ions, and so they move a lot faster, and they impose much stiffer timescales that we have to resolve in our time step. But if you're pretty sure that the electrons are going to be like in local thermal equilibrium and follow a Boltzmann distribution, then you can just bake that assumption in, and we can step over those timescales with no problem. And so this is really useful for like plasma sheath simulations, and I kind of am showing that in a verification study that I did here with a simple kind of hydrogen plasma sheath, where as I increase the number of macroparticles that I'm using to model the plasma, we converge to an analytic solution for the electric potential here at order 1/2, which is as expected. So that kind of shows that HPIT2 is doing what we want and giving us the right answer. And I can't talk about supercomputing without talking about performance. I'm not showing a scalability plot here, or a scalability study, but what I am showing is that we get some pretty extreme speedups by exploiting GPUs. both on the Summit supercomputer down in Oak Ridge and the Delta supercomputer at Illinois at the NCSA. Compared to like a CPU-only run, when we start to use GPUs, we get just insane speedups. So the wall time here is decreased by like 5 times. So that was HPIC2, or some of the innovations that we've added to HPIC2. And now I'll talk about the project that I worked on at Sandia during one of my residencies, where we attempt to identify when particles in a single species hybrid simulation start to look like a fluid and merge those into the fluid. And the reason we might want to do this is that it's pretty often that we have simulations where we start off with a plasma that's initially very far from equilibrium, so it's a bad fluid. But due to collisions over time, like over the course of the simulation, it starts to thermalize, and we start to end up with a good fluid. And it's wasteful to simulate this newly thermalized plasma kinetically. And so ideally we want a hybrid merge method, as I call it, to attempt to find thermalized subsets of particles and add those into the underlying fluid. And the way that I approach this problem is to kind of work backwards. So assuming that I have a given subset of particles, a weighted subset of particles that I want to merge into the fluid, it's going to have it's going to combine with the fluid to form a combined distribution. And that combined distribution has to be a good fluid, and that imposes some constraints that we can then back propagate onto the particles that we've kind of selected or guessed. So simply put, the combined distribution is going to be the sum of the merged particle and pre-merged fluid distributions. And to be super safe, I'm going to assume that both the pre-merged fluid and the combined fluid distributions are drifting Maxwellian, because that's kind of the safest fluid that you can have. And obviously, it's impossible to check that this equation is satisfied for all v in in velocity space, given like kind of an initial guess of particles. So instead, I'm going to pick a finite number of moments and take those moments of this equation, and we only have to check like finitely many moments. So at this point, there's 2 things that we can do. What I called the static fluid method assumes that the combined distribution has the same average velocity and temperature as the pre-merged fluid. And essentially what this means is it imposes the constraint that merged particles are just going to basically scale the pre-merged fluid density up. And it's not going to shift it around in velocity space or perturb it. And given this assumption and the assumption that particles form a weighted sum of direct deltas in velocity space, we can turn the equation from the previous slide into this mess here, which looks bad, but you'll note that it's linear in the particle weights, W here. So we have a system of linear equations. This is just something that it's just a scalar basically that you can compute. So the unknowns here, in the system of linear equations, the unknowns are the particle weights. The number of equations is the number of choices for moments that we want to check, and the solution to this gives us the weights of particles that we want to merge into the fluid. Generally, the system is underdetermined, so we have many, many more particles than we have moments that we want to check. And so there isn't one solution to this. So instead, we can recast this as a problem where we want to maximize the total weight of particles that are merged in, subject to the constraints given by this system of equations. And that sounds like an esoteric problem, but it turns out that there's a lot of commercial off-the-shelf algorithms and software that are designed to handle this. So you can kind of take your pick there. The second way that we can do this is a much less stringent assumption. We can linearize the moments of the combined distribution, assuming that the particle weights, each individual particle weight is small compared to the fluid density. This assumption is, like I said, is less strong. It's more forgiving than the static fluid case. And so essentially what this allows the merged particles to kind of jostle the fluid distribution around a little bit and perturb it a little bit. And that means that we have a little bit more freedom to merge in more particles while still maintaining a good combined fluid distribution. So again, under this assumption, it's still linear, so we again form a linear system of equations, again with the particle weights as unknown, so we end up with basically the same problem as before. The equations in this case are too complicated to display, but I guess take my word for it that it's going to end up being pretty much the same with just different scalars in the linear system of equations. And we're going to take the same strategy as before. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to show results from the dynamic fluid hybrid merge because it just looks a little bit better. So I've implemented this in the Empire plasma simulation code, which is developed at Sandia. And in this first test case, I'm going to initialize 2 Maxwellian groups of particles that are kind of far apart in velocity space. And then I'm going to have a fluid distribution that sits right on top of one of those particle populations. And ideally, I'm going to apply hybrid merge, and hybrid merge will only merge particles in from the particle distribution that sits right on top of the fluid. So I've illustrated them in different colors, the two particle populations, green and orange here, but hybrid merge can't distinguish between the two. Basically, all it sees is just a list of velocities. So this is just for kind of illustration purposes. And we see that before applying hybrid merge, yeah, the fluid distribution sits right on top of that particle distribution, and afterward, hybrid merge elects only to merge in particles from the particle distribution that sits right on top of it. And it does that pretty well. It basically merges all of the particles with just a small number remaining. And then I kind of threw it for a loop by the second test case here, where we have a little bit of overlap between the two particle populations. And in this case, again, hybrid merge can't distinguish between the two, so it elects, in this case, to merge in some of the particles from the orange population, but to kind of compensate, it only merges a few particles, or it merges fewer particles kind of from the left here. All right, I think it's about time for me to be done here, but just one last slide here. This kind of shows, this is a kind of a thermalization problem with a known analytic thermalization rate, and we show that hybrid merge doesn't throw off the thermalization rate, and by the end of the simulation, we have most of the representation is in the fluid, and we have fewer macroparticles than we start off with, almost close to zero. So I'm just going to throw my funding acknowledgements on the screen, and at this point, I'll take any questions.